I'd like to welcome you tonight to this webinar on Sherlock, the case of the empty tomb, historical apologetics through the eyes of a criminal investigator. And I'd like to thank, the ministry, webinar ministry. I'd like to thank especially Per for giving his time to us tonight. I think it's very interesting that you brought together, as you said, fiction, also history and apologetics. I think it's something unique and very relevant, I think, today in how for us Christians in finding ways on how to share the gospel. So, welcome, Per,
Thank you.
and yes, I'd just like to give a brief introduction of Per. Before he gives uh, his talk on his book. He told me just while we were waiting for others to join online that this is his first book in English. So
Nice.
privileged also to hear about this from him tonight. So he is Per is the director of the Clapham Institute. So it's a Swedish Christian think tank and research institute, and he is also the author of 5 books on, as mentioned, his field: apologetics, human dignity, and how to convey the gospel in a secular society. In addition, he writes weekly editorials in one of Sweden's Christian dailies. And congratulations, you started working on your PhD thesis. I've heard and his thesis is on it's just looking at historical driving forces that made Sweden the most secular and individualistic nation in the world. So we actually see the connection here, the interest in how to share the gospel in such a secular society that you live in Sweden. So he's married with 4 children, and I think I turn it over to you now. Maybe you want to add something more about yourself before you start the teaching tonight. So thank you, Per, and welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think it was solid and covering almost everything that we need for this matter. So thank you very much from the forum for the introduction and the possibility to interact and to lecture tonight. Welcome to those of you that follow online now, and welcome to those of you that follow the recording afterwards. So you gave a good introduction to the topic and to myself. So just to explain how I plan to use the time, I plan first to give quite a thorough introduction on sources and how to use and work with historical sources when you conduct historical science, and then move on to how in different creative ways to present the gospel and the message in our time and in our culture. And after that, depending a bit on how much time we have left, spend some time in going through the historical facts that we have at hand, which leads us into certain conclusions. So that's a bit on how I plan to spend the time here. I'd like to begin with a situation which sort of gave rise to the idea to begin working with preaching and defending the resurrection. I saw a newspaper article in my local newspaper a couple of years ago. There was a church who were having some kind of Easter conference, and apparently the young youth leader in the congregation, she said, and probably felt a bit awkward before the secular journalist when she talked about, well, we have Easter, we have the crucifixion, and we have the resurrection. And she sort of felt that, well, what if they don't believe this? This sounds very strange. We believe in somebody who died and was risen again. So she said like this, and see if this will work. Yes. She said, well, you know, this isn't science. Somehow retreating back into some kind of position where she felt that, oh, of course, I understand that this doesn't sound very reasonable, but we can believe it anyway and preach it anyway. And I think that's not a good position to start with, because that puts us in a very awkward situation when we try to study the historical Jesus. Either we run into this situation where we have a faceless shadow that we don't know anything about. We can just believe in our heart, but we don't know very much about him, which leads us into the next trap, which is this trap, that Jesus could be anyone, anything that we would like him to be or describe him to be. Anyone can invent his or her own Jesus. And these are just a number of examples that appear in present time. I particularly like, if you look at the right bottom, the cricket Jesus. I think it looks fun. But that is not the case, that anyone can invent whichever picture of Jesus that they want, because I think that this youth leader is wrong. This is science. You know, it is science because we have sources. And that's how you do historical science in all time periods, in all cultures, in all contexts. Myself, as was said in the introduction, I do my PhD thesis on Swedish 20th century history. Today I've been studying sources from the 1920s and the 1930s. And you do more or less the same way as you do with sources from antiquity. You study them, you use critical evaluation, and you separate what's reliable from what is not reliable. And when it comes to Jesus, we do have sources. And that's the starting point. So how do you perform when you have sources? And the picture I show here is from a public debate I had last year about the resurrection. The man on the right of the picture is one of Sweden's leading atheists, who is not a historian. So I have to praise him for participating in the debate. He's an evolutionary biologist. But he figured that Christians are basically stupid. They believe that the man dies and then he jumps back to life again. And that's stupid, so I can take the debate. But I began this debate by, well, first showing let's see if you can see it in here. It's clockwise. It's a mirror. The last copy of National Geographic, which was about the historical Jesus, that we actually know things about the historical Jesus through archaeology and through other sources. So I started by saying that I am a Christian, and we are Christians, and we can defend the gospel by being Christians, and we can do this very much better than if we were, for instance, Buddhists. Because if you're a Buddhist, you say that you only find the truth from inside. You come up with the truth through meditation and stuff, but you don't get it from the external world. And I said, neither am I a Muslim. The Muslims claim that a man, Muhammad, got the information from heaven, from Allah, and you're supposed to believe it. You're not supposed to control it. You're supposed to believe it without proof. But I am a Christian, and we can face this issue with boldness as Christians, because we have a faith which arose in a particular city, Jerusalem, with particular people that we read about in the source material. It began on a particular day, historical day, Easter Sunday. So we have a faith which is based on events and facts that were possible to check at the time, and that separates Christianity from more or less all other faiths in the world, because they're based on revelation. Somebody claims that I have this revelation, I send it out to you, and you're supposed to believe it. Christianity is not like that. It's based on historical facts and historical sources that we can check and evaluate. So what then are the sources to this very peculiar and particular event in history? when we study historical sources, we would like to have physical artifacts. That's what we like to combine written sources with. And you see, I put a question mark after. So we're not sure that we have physical artifacts. We may have the tomb. I don't know if any of you have visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I haven't, but it would be amazing to visit it. And it may actually be the case that the rock tomb preserved there within this small chapel called the Edicule is actually the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth, but we don't know it for sure. It may be the case that the burial cloth, the burial shroud, now located in a chapel in the Cathedral of Turin in Italy, it may be the case that this remarkable piece of clothing is the actual burial cloth of Jesus, but we don't know it for sure. So therefore, the physical artifacts are not the most important historical sources in order to understand and defend the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, the written sources is by far the most important when understanding, discussing, defending, and preaching the resurrection. So therefore, over to the written sources and how to handle them. If we look at sources outside the New Testament, because a lot of critics, they say that, well, you can't use sources within the New Testament. They are written by people who believe that Jesus was the Messiah, was risen again. So you can't use them, they're biased. You have to use sources from outside. And we have a number of sources from outside the New Testament. For instance, Josephus, the Jewish historian. We have Tacitus, the Roman historian. We have the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, which mentions Jesus, claims that he was a miracle worker, but that he was a false prophet. That's around 200 AD. And we have the Apostolic Fathers, the earliest Christian writings after the New Testament, etc. We have a number of others. These are just examples. But the question then is, why don't we go to the best sources? Because that's how historians work all the time, in all kinds of historical events. They try to separate the not so valuable sources and use the best sources. And those are what I have here in my hand. That's the amazing thing, that more or less anyone can have the best sources at hand, at least in our nations. There are nations where it's forbidden, because those who rule those countries understand that this may be a very revolutionary message. So here is the Greek New Testament. Those are the sources. And I put a picture here for you to see. If anyone recognizes this picture, or this very tiny part of an old papyrus, this is found in Manchester, of all places, and it came very handy if you write a story about a person living in Britain. So he and his companions may go to Manchester to see these very exciting historical artifacts, these historical documents. This is the papyrus P52 in John Ryland's library in Manchester. And the fantastic thing about this small piece of historical source is that it's the oldest existing piece of New Testament text. It's from John's 18th chapter, which actually takes place in the morning of Good Friday, when Jesus is facing Pilate and being accused of the Jewish leaders. Pilate brings Jesus back. And I have to read a part of it, I think, because it's such a fascinating piece of text, reminding of actually what we say here. And I use this in the introduction to the Sherlock book as well. It says, Jesus says to Pilate, "For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And I think it's a fantastic quote to appear in the oldest existing piece of text from the New Testament. And the fantastic thing is that it's so incredibly close to when John wrote his gospel in the end of the 1st century. This copy is with great certainty written in the first decades in the 2nd century. So it's very, very close to the events. So we have good written sources. Now, when we evaluate the reliability of historical sources, any historical sources, we use a number of criteria. And I've been working as a history teacher in the high school and for adult students for a number of years. And when we begin the course, I always begin with these criteria because they are important in order to understand how to work with history and how to work with sources. So we need to know about the authenticity. For instance, the so-called diaries of Adolf Hitler appeared in the 1980s. Everyone was thrilled. What an exciting historical source to figure out what the Führer actually thought, for a couple of weeks, until it turned out that they were forgeries. And they moved from incredibly interesting to not interesting at all. We need to know that they are authentic. We want the time span to be as narrow as possible. In antiquity, the trouble is that we rarely have time spans less than a few centuries. Sometimes we have information about the great men of antiquity, the great leaders, that are 300 or 400 years from the events in question. And those are the best that we have, so we have to use those sources. But it's way better if we have sources that are closer in time. Dependency. We want to have first-hand witnesses, if possible. If not possible, we would like to have second-hand witnesses and so on. And we also would like to have a number of witnesses, and we would like them to be independent from each other. If we don't have that, we have to work with what we have. And there are often cases in history where we only have one source. So we have to work with that and try to figure out critically what to trust in it and what to be skeptical about. But the best thing is that we have a number of independent sources. Next criterion is tendency. And here people may attack the Gospels, for instance, saying that, well, these are written by people who accepted Jesus as Messiah. And almost all historical sources have a tendency. Pro something, con something. That is why we write things, because we want to defend something or contradict something. Tendency does not mean that we have to throw the source away. It just means that we have to understand what is the tendency, how does it affect the content of the source. So we have to evaluate the tendency. Next thing is that, if possible, we would like the facts to be, there would be a possibility of confirmation. If we can't confirm anything, we have to be slightly critical and slightly skeptical, until we are able to confirm them through archaeology or some other method. So if a fact can be controlled and confirmed, it highly raises the probability that the facts are true. If you can't control it, people can come up with or lie about more or less anything. And the next thing is that when you are a criminal investigator, especially if you're a policeman or policewoman in the modern world, you listen to a story and try to figure out, are there any unexpected ingredients or disturbing facts that a false story would not contain? If there are such elements, that raises the probability that the story is true as well. And this goes for all kinds of historical sources, modern, medieval, ancient, all kinds. And the thing is, when we study the sources that we have at hand for the mystery that we study here, is that if we study the best sources, not the non-Christian sources, but the best sources for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the thing is that they fill all these criteria. Criteria, it's supposed to be. Never mind the misspelling. And that's very surprising it may seem to those that do not believe, or those that are skeptical, and it's also encouraging for us who have a Christian confession and would like it to be reliable, and it is. So from this, we would like to study the best sources. What are then the best sources about the resurrection? Where do we find them? Well, one surprise, both to those that don't study the current scholarship about it, and those that stand completely on the outside. I let Sherlock Holmes do the same thing in this story. Is that the surprising fact is that the best, according to scholars, is Paul. Not Paul himself, whatever he comes up with, but particularly the creedal tradition that he refers to and repeats in 1 Corinthians 15. That he states that I gave this to you the last time, or the first time I was with you, and I also received this when I was first in Jerusalem and met the apostles, the witnesses. Then this creedal tradition was complete and done in its form, and it explains that Christ he died, he was buried, and he was resurrected, and he was seen by these witnesses, these witnesses, these witnesses. And this is an incredibly early source. Even critical scholars claim that this is an oral tradition that dates back to just very, very shortly after the cross. Some say a few months, some say 2 years, but the thing is that it's as close as anyone can be to the events in question. So there you have the time perspective. We also have oral testimonies, which were later written down. Where do we find these? We find them mostly in Acts. Luke has written them down. There are a number of sermons that were held by Peter in the beginning of Acts. He holds 4 different speeches in Acts 2 to 5. And these are oral testimonies that were repeated, checked that they were repeated in the correct form, and then Luke wrote them down. And here too, even critical scholars like Per Ewert states that this is an oral tradition that dates back to the first decade after the crucifixion. We also have oral testimonies that Paul delivers in Acts that Luke also writes down afterwards. So we have a number of these very early oral testimonies about what happened. We also have, obviously, written testimonies, and those are the ones that we think of spontaneously. For instance, the Gospels are the most important ones when it comes to the whole life of Jesus. But when it comes to the burial and especially the resurrection, there are other sources. The Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and oral testimonies. So the Gospels are very important as sources, but they are not the only sources. And also we have the non-Christian historians who talk about Jesus' resurrection, but they're later in time, they're further away in dependency, they're not first or second-hand witnesses, so they are not as important as historical sources. So those sources that you see here, those are the sources that all people use, all scholars, even if they believe in the resurrection or if they refuse to believe anything about the resurrection of Jesus, but they surely find that here is a historical core of historical facts. And we're going to come back to those, what the historical core is. Then there's a question, sometimes we rewrite history. We have believed certain things about history, what has happened, and then something happens that makes us change our minds and our view of history. And there are numbers of stories, articles, news items about people coming up with all kinds of rewritten new versions of the Jesus story. And that makes us think why all these new Jesuses. There may be a reason, not a truth-seeking reason, but another reason for it. But here's an example of what you see in news item. The inside story of a controversial new text about Jesus. Fascinating, eh? Completely new information. We may have to revise and throw out all that we thought we knew about Jesus. According to a top religion scholar, this 1600-year-old text fragment. That's very old, isn't it? suggests some early Christians believed Jesus was married, possibly to Mary Magdalene. And people start becoming a bit dizzy, doubting. Well, what if everything is made up? What if any source is as good as another source? There are a number of words here you see in this article that make us think that, well, we have to be somewhat distanced to this. According to, suggests, some, believed, possibly. And also, how old is this text fragment? It's very old, right? 1600 years old, super old. We have to believe it. But then, think about it. How far away from the events is a 1600-year-old text? Those are 400 years away. That's very far away from the events. You can think of another example. If I were to write a new story about, let's say, the French Revolution, that's just a little bit more than 200 years ago. If I were to come up with a story saying that, well, you know, the French Revolution was actually about something contrafactual that I would come up with, nobody would believe that, because I'm more than 200 years away. I'm not a credible source. We have other sources which are closer in time and closer in geography to France and the events in France at the end of the 18th century when the French Revolution actually took place. So just because we see that a source is old, it's not reliable. It doesn't mean that it's reliable. So therefore, don't fall into that trap and say that, oh, I see a news item saying that we have to rewrite history. We don't, until accessible source material provides reason to rewrite history. And we have very good historical sources within the New Testament, and we don't have better outside. So from that, about sources then, that was quite a long introduction, as I said in the beginning. Here are some points that I thought about how to contextualize, that I've tried to do with this book, that this webinar is based on, is how to contextualize. There is a need to contextualize, to put a message in a context that people can access. And I've got a few examples here that I'd like to show you. Here is one story that you may have heard. A man was walking to Jericho and he was attacked by robbers. And then this and this and this happened. I think you know the story. A man had two sons. One day the younger came to his father and said, "Give me my part of the fortune," and so on. That's quite a famous story. The kingdom of heaven is like this, that, like a mustard seed, like a treasure buried in a field, and so on. You know these stories. People heard these stories. Maybe they were repeated a number of times in order to help the listeners understand the message that Jesus was trying to convey. And obviously you understand that these are Jesus stories, because Jesus is not only, as we call him, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, he is also the great contextualizer. So if you look at Jesus, how he preaches, how he delivers his messages, he so often uses pictures, parables, other ways of making people understand, because the kingdom of heaven, I mean, that's in heaven. It's difficult to understand to us here on earth. Jesus gives these pictures, and we can do the same. We can use old pictures, allegories, parables, and so on, and we can use modern ones. I'll give you a few examples of how we can do it. We can use available examples of stories that have already been told or events that have already taken place. I use one example in this book when explaining and discussing different suggestions, different hypotheses of what could have happened to Jesus's body. How did it disappear from the tomb? I use this example of, I don't know if you can see the letters, it says Lincoln. This is the grave monument, a huge one, of Abraham Lincoln, US president. There was a very strange idea to snatch Lincoln's body, not just after his funeral, but a number of years later. And I use this story in the Sherlock book to give the example of that people have an actual reason to kidnap a dead body. In this case, get two guys from this criminal gang set free from prison, and the other to get a ransom from the state. But this idea failed completely. It was a terribly bad concocted idea. So it failed, but it shoots well as an example of why would anyone try to steal a body? Because they want to have a motive. You can use other, this is a real story that I use. You can use made up stories. And let's see how many recognize this picture. I don't. I found the picture on the internet because I know it's a well-known story. There is apparently a game and there are apparently thrones, but I've never watched the TV serial, not one bit of it actually. But I know it's a famous story, and people obviously know a lot about these characters and how they relate to each other and about the drama. And you can use this as a way to present the battle between good and evil, the battle between Christ and the enemy, and the great story. Tolkien did the same thing with the Lord of the Rings story. C.S. Lewis did the thing in the stories about Narnia and so on. You can always use some kind of mythology, some kind of story to convey a deeper message, and that's quite common. There's another picture I would like to show you that I actually ran into yesterday. This is a statue in the Cathedral of Stockholm. I live in the south of Sweden, but I was in Stockholm yesterday. I was doing studies in the Parliament Library, studying old Parliament protocols. But first I went into the Cathedral of Stockholm and went up to see this quite famous and quite hideous, actually, statue. It's St. George and the Dragon. It's an old mythology, but it's placed within the cathedral, and it's a famous picture in Christian tradition as well. And you can use the story, and I used it in my personal devotion, and I read the scripture from Revelation about the battle between good and evil. So the story about St. George and the Dragon is another story. It's an ancient myth, but you can use it in order to explain a deeper meaning and the bigger story. You can also put real people in other contexts. You can make real people into fiction in order to give a message as well. And here's one example. I don't know if you have read this. This is by Ravi Zacharias, the famous apologist. This book is called The Lotus and the Cross. Jesus Talks with Buddha. And we have never read any other book about Jesus talking with Buddha because he didn't. They lived 600 years apart and half a continent apart as well. But Ravi Zacharias, he creates, based on Buddha's teaching and based on Jesus's teaching, a way how they would communicate with each other, revealing what is the content of Buddhism, what is the content of biblical Christianity. That is also a way, through the means of fiction, to convey and communicate the gospel. And which brings us to the theme that we talk about here today and tonight, which is this story that I made up. And I'll show you clockwise then. Here is the cover of the Sherlock book, the book Sherlock, the Case of the Empty Tomb, which was published in English this spring before Easter. And the idea behind this story, I haven't mentioned it before, I saved it for now, was that I once in a newspaper article saw an article about a priest who dressed up as Sherlock Holmes to deliver a sermon. Good idea, I thought. I thought a few minutes about it, and then the idea sprang to my head. What if, because I love the character Sherlock Holmes, I've been studying him thoroughly, intensely in his different versions of the different stories by Conan Doyle and by others. And I was thrilled by his intellectual capacity and his way of reasoning up to truth. So I figured, what if the greatest scientific criminal investigator were to investigate the historical evidence for what happened? How would a very skeptical person evaluate the historical evidence? concerning these events around this very peculiar Passover holiday in Jerusalem some 2,000 years ago. So I put a fictitious character and put him into studying the historical evidence. And that is obviously a way to help the reader to understand how solid is the evidence, what can we actually know, not believe by faith, but what can we actually know about these events, and what conclusions can we draw from these facts. So that was the idea behind this book. And you can buy it on Amazon and where you buy books. But some advice that I would like to send from our friend Sherlock Holmes, the detective. This is a statue of him, not from Baker Street, London, but from Edinburgh, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born and grew up. There are a number of points and pieces of advice from Sherlock Holmes' own methods in the Conan Doyle stories that I've used in my book, and that I try to put a focus on when talking about these issues like today. One is this: always start with facts, because especially not with Christians, but with skeptics, they may have the strangest, the weirdest hypothesis about anything, about who Jesus was, where he came from, what happened these peculiar days around Passover. But you can't do that if you're interested in the truth. You have to begin with the facts. And that's very important. And when you have the facts gathered, then you can go on and try to come up with certain conclusions, and probably, hopefully, the best conclusion, the most well-founded conclusion. And another piece of advice is when you run into some kind of fake news, because you tend to do in modern media, and you may run into fake news, old news in history as well. I occasionally use an example from a couple of years ago, just a few years ago. I don't know if you've heard about or remember the gold train, the Nazi gold train that the Nazis filled with gold in the end of the Second World War, sent it away somewhere in Poland and hid it, trying to find it after the war and get the gold. But the train disappeared, and so did the gold. And there were stories around the world a few years ago stating that now we are almost entirely sure that we have located the gold train. Have you read more about the gold train? Seen pictures from the gold train? No, you haven't, because there was nothing to it. There was absolutely no factual evidence behind these allegations. I read one article about a person in Poland claiming that he was 99% sure that he had found this train underneath a castle somewhere in Poland. But as long as he was 99% or 1% or anything there in between, he wasn't 100% sure. So if you run into these kind of fake news, ideas that people throw around, it may have been this, it may have been that, but without any supporting evidence, we remain skeptical until we have solid evidence. And here's one final thing about Sherlock Holmes' method, which is when we have excluded all alternatives, now when we have gathered the facts, when we have excluded all alternatives that are either unthinkable or practically impossible, and only one alternative remains, this implacably has to be the truth. It doesn't matter whether we like it, whether we find it probable or not. If we have got rid of all the false solutions and only one remains, it has to be logically the truth. And from there, I just like to put us quite quickly through the facts that we have and the facts that we can present as safe facts that also critical scholars accept. And those are: one, Jesus died on a cross. We know that Jesus was dead when they put him in the tomb. It was not the case that he fell asleep, false died, swooned, and then woke up. We know from a number of sources, Roman, Jewish, within the Gospels and others, that Jesus died. No serious historian questions that. They laid Jesus in a known grave. They laid him in the rock tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. And we know this because we have 4 very different, independent accounts in the Gospels. He's mentioned by name, he's mentioned by living, the place where he lived. So even critical scholars know that Jesus was buried there by Joseph of Arimathea. And the women knew and saw where he was put to rest. The third point is not always used in apologetical context, but I think it's important because after the death of Jesus, his followers didn't just go home and say that, okay, that's Good Friday evening, we wait for Easter Sunday, and then everything's jolly good again. No, they had lost all hope. They had followed someone they believed to be the Messiah, but he was not the Messiah because he died. All Jewish sources that we have explain that people did not believe in a resurrection before the end of time. But here is where it all changes. This we know, that a few days after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty. And here is obviously the mystery that I tried to present in the case of the empty tomb. How do you solve this mystery? We have a number of reasons why we know that Jesus' tomb was found empty on the Sunday morning after the Sabbath. And 5, something even more remarkable, that shortly thereafter, Jesus' followers began to preach that they had met him as risen. And this seems to be the most peculiar change within the scholarly world during the last 10-20 years, that more and more scholars, believers and non-believers, have agreed that, yeah, his followers communicated that they had met him as risen. They did have these experiences, and the skeptic needs to explain it in some way, but it's pretty much consensus that the disciples had these experiences of meeting the resurrected Jesus. And to add, the disciples were fully convinced that their message of the resurrection was true. It was not something that they said because they liked to and they hoped to get some kind of career after the crucifixion or something like that. No, we know that they were fully convinced up till death that the message of the resurrection was true. And not only followers of Jesus, male and female, but also skeptics like James, Jesus' brother, who did not believe that he was the Messiah, and enemies like Paul, they also testified to having met the risen Jesus. So it was not just his friends hoping that something good would come out of this tragedy, but also those that did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And then when he finally died, they had to have become even more sure that he was not the Messiah. Something extraordinary must have happened to make them change their minds. And this is a fact that applies and has given non-believers also good reason to think that, well, this is really, really strong evidence that there may be actually be something in this. So from this then, we have these facts, and it may be the case that we have to come back to them in the Q&A afterwards. But based on these facts, and I have to repeat, when I had this debate against the atheists last year, I presented these 7 historical facts to him, and I was prepared for him to try to dispute them and claim that, well, no, we don't really believe that. We don't really believe that. And then I had prepared some kind of arguments to defend those. And after I'd gone through them, he said about all of them, yep, Jesus died, yep, he was laid in a known tomb, yep, the tomb was empty, and so on. Also with the followers' experiences, yep, they apparently met him and saw him as risen. And it surprised me quite a bit, but that also shows that we really have a really strong historical case, not just a belief in our hearts, but we have a strong historical base to stand upon. And from these facts, we have to draw a plausible conclusion. And this is where this debate turned a bit weird, because my opponent, after having said that, yeah, all these facts are true, he sort of retreated into some kind of very strange position where he claimed that, and I quote now, maybe Jesus was fetched by a Nordic Valkyria to Valhall, the home of the Nordic gods, or maybe the devil wrote the New Testament. And I thought, this is amazing. The facts are apparently so strong that you have to come up with the weirdest hypothesis that you would never use in any other situation. The better thing is that if you are a really truth-seeking detective or a person, you have to try to figure out which is the most plausible conclusion when we have these facts. I would agree with N.T. Wright, who says that the historian, not the priest, not the preacher, may and must say that all other explanations for why Christianity arose and why it took the shape it did are far less convincing as historical explanations than the one the early Christians themselves offer, that Jesus really did rise from the dead on Easter morning, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And I think that is the conclusion that all people would come to if they evaluate the historical evidence with an open heart and with an open mind. And I think that with that, we close this part of the session.
Yes, thank you very much, Per. And yeah, look, you can also turn on your mic or video as we go to the Q&A. Thank you for that really contextualizing, as you said, a explanation of the resurrection, and of course your emphasis in your presentation that as Christians we have history on our side. I have also a few questions, but I'd like to maybe ask Luke if you have a question to ask Per. Go ahead. Or I think you wrote actually something when you registered, so you can go ahead and ask him the question. Yeah. So can you, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I actually don't remember the specific question that I wrote when I read that, but I do also have some questions as of now. But I firstly wanted to just say, Per, that it's really awesome to have people like you, where God is using to just establish truth for what it is, and obviously the reality of our world currently is a complete tack on truth, and it's basically ability to exist. And I think my question for you is, or the one that comes to mind first. It was really interesting for me too that you're Swedish and are operating in this context and developing all of this study in this context. And I was just curious for you, do you feel like when you have conversations with people with, I mean, like young people, let's say less than 40, do you find that this is one of the key questions, or are there other questions that you like that come up more frequently, or are more difficult for people to understand, kind of a bigger barrier to Christianity when you have these kind of talks with people in Sweden?
Yeah, and I think this goes within the whole Western world, perhaps more in Sweden, but obviously, like you live in Germany, right?
I live in Poland.
All right. Yeah. But the thing is with our culture is that we are, as you mentioned, some kind of post-truth culture where people have a tendency to fall into fake news, fake old news, and doubt truth. So that is part of the problem, that if you try to present a message that I think that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and you get the reaction, yeah, so what? It may be for you, but what if it isn't for me? Yeah. And the thing that people reject truth. And that's a bit troublesome, because you have to sort of cave your way through this skeptical mindset, because skepticism or relativism per se is a false philosophy, because it falls apart under its own weight. Because if you try it, all things are relative, it falls apart because it's self-refuting and so on. So that's a bit of the problem, that you have to sort of get your way into the true questions, and then the true facts, and then the true solutions. But that's good if you have a possibility to present a book, have a real debate, and that's really revealing, because then the atheist or the denier of the resurrection stand very much without arguments. You have to come up with those very strange examples that I mentioned.
Cool. That's really helpful. Go ahead.
There were two questions, and one of them was possibly from you, that were mailed in beforehand, and they're pretty alike. How do you explain the resurrection to those who don't believe it? And is there something that you find helpful when addressing secular people? And these are basically just two ways to describe people who don't believe in the resurrection, who don't believe in the gospel, who don't believe in the biblical worldview. And I think that a bit like this is a bit like it was in the first church, before there actually was a church, because nobody believed in the resurrection after the death of Jesus, because they knew that there had been other Messiah figures. Gamaliel, he mentions them in Acts, when he talks about Judas the Galilean, who gathered large crowds, and then they died, and then the movement died with them. We had just to wait. So nobody expected a new movement to rise when the Messiah figure had died. And you remember when they go to the empty tomb, the women, they don't believe that Jesus is risen just because they find an empty tomb. And when they go back to the disciples and say that we think that Jesus is risen, they say that, well, we don't believe that. We've seen him. We saw him die. He's dead. So people were very skeptical on good reasons. So that's why when you meet somebody who says that I can't believe, it's impossible to believe that someone was dead and then is alive again, that was exactly the same situation that the first believers were in. They knew that everything was finished, that everything was hopeless. But when they actually met Jesus and were able to check in one way, a second way, a third way, that it was actually him, that he had actually risen again, then they could go out and preach to anyone, anywhere, that Jesus is risen. And you can do whatever you like to us. You may threaten us, you may beat us, you may even kill us, but we will never, as long as we live, be silent about what we have seen and heard.
If I could ask one more question.
Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Just also in kind of hearing where you're at with your studies as well, where you're looking at the last century, I was kind of curious, what are some of the key reasons that you feel like Sweden, maybe as the specific example, although obviously, as you've mentioned, it's far broader, but in the last century, maybe specifically Sweden has gone in such a direction and such a intensity in as a secular society?
Yeah, partly it's because of political decisions in Sweden, and that's why I tried to address in my dissertation. But to connect to this theme, it's also a matter that can relate to all people, because if you think of when Jesus stands before Pilate and the people on the morning of the Friday morning, and they know that he's a good man. They know that he has performed miracles. They know that he is more or less love personified, but still he annoys them. So they get this furious reaction that get rid of him, away with him, crucify him, or whatever. We can't stand him anymore. There is something about Jesus, about God as authority, because all autonomous cultures, if we call them that, who put man at the center of all things, they have this tendency to put God away. That's a story that goes all the way back to the garden, where man listens to the lie that says that if you become God yourself, you can decide what's right and wrong. You can get rid of this God. It's better that you become free if you become God yourself. And that could be partly what you see in Pilate's palace when people reject Jesus, want to get rid of him. And that's quite, when Paul preaches the message of the resurrection, he always runs into problem. I don't know if you've noticed that, but he can talk about a lot of things, preach about different things, and people listen. But when it comes to the resurrection, people get furious or they laugh at him. If the resurrection would have been false, they would have got rid of that message immediately, because it doesn't make sense, and people become angry if they would have been postmodern ancient people, so to speak. They would have found another way to preach some kind of gospel. Be nice to each other, show love and those kinds. But if you think of when Paul stands before Festus and Agrippa, and he's questioned, he describes things all over again, his journey, his personal journey, and what happened to him and to Jesus, and when it comes to the resurrection. The same thing happens again, that Agrippa becomes furious and say, you're mad, Paul. And Paul does not say, like a postmodern philosopher or theologian saying that, well, you know, this isn't science. You can believe it anyway. Call me stupid or mad, but I believe it anyway, and you could too. He says, what I say is true and reliable. And he adds, I can't believe that your Majesty is unaware of these. They haven't happened in a place far away. It happened where you could investigate the evidence. Check the tomb, the empty tomb. Check the witnesses and ask them. So that's what's so encouraging, that we rely on a solid ground, and therefore we may continue to preach it, even though it's sometimes difficult for people to listen in our culture. But we know that people have a longing in their hearts for the truth and for a meaning of life. And if Jesus is resurrected, there is meaning to life, because there is a continuation of life after death.
Thank you very much, Per. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Per. Yeah, maybe I will just follow up also on Luke's question. I think the challenge for sharing the gospel, and especially also the apologetics in this very secular society, but as you said, not only in Sweden but most of the world right now, is not to only engage the mind but also the heart. Because I was just really very interested in what you said about the conclusion of your debate with the atheist, that after presenting all the facts and him agreeing, so he would still rather believe another explanation rather than face the facts. So I think that's what I wanted to ask. What are the reasons that you come up against when you, after presenting the authenticity of the resurrection, what are the reasons that people still don't choose to believe it? And I think it must. So it's not anymore an intellectual reason that matter. I would think. Because we've engaged them on this level, on the factual level, or the probability of this. So, I think so. That's one of the questions I would like to ask, and where and how do we go about also actually engaging the heart as well, together with the mind, and engaging apologetics.
Yeah, And that's a fascinating thing about the gospel. I usually end my lectures by showing one picture of a brain, saying that we can use our brain all we like in natural science, in historical science, and find out that the biblical worldview under the gospel is true. And we can also use what is in our heart. As I mentioned earlier, there's a longing for meaning, longing for love, longing for personhood and relationship and so on. But partly, I guess that it's also the same reaction that we meet today that the earliest disciples and other people in Jerusalem experienced. You remember the story in Matthew 28, when the high priests, they realized that the body's gone. We have to do something. We have to come up with something. And then they say that it's only Matthew who states this story. So it's not as historically reliable as some other facts. I think there is good reason to believe the story, but the most important thing is that Matthew recounts that this is the story that is present in Jewish society when the time that he writes his gospel. So we know that this is a story that has gone around, that the soldiers were bribed to say that the disciples stole the body. And one fact that we know from this story is that the enemies of Jesus knew that the tomb was empty, and they had no idea where the body had gone. So they say in the story in Matthew 28 that we understand that something really, really extraordinary has happened. We can't deny it. Therefore, we have to come up with a different conclusion. Well, what if they knew that Jesus' body was missing from the tomb, there was no rational explanation, and people were starting to claim that they had met him as risen? Why not believe that he was risen? Some priests did. Acts 6 states that some priests came to believe the gospel, the message. So some apparently believed because they wanted to use their hearts and their minds. But some brought in the disciples, questioned them, beat them up, because they said that we have to stop this, because this threatens our position, our worldview, and so on. So that is the thing, that a lot of people who reject the resurrection do so because they don't want to change their basic worldview. They don't want to leave the place where they are the center of all things. There is a Swedish singer called Eva Dahlgren who wrote a song called Who Lights the Stars in English, which I borrowed to my first book about apologetics, about the creation and so on. And she, one day, after she had written this song, which is about, well, you know, marveling about the universe and asking the big questions, she was asked to write the music to a requiem. And the church musician asked her, well, you believe in God, right? And she said, well, I'm not sure. I had to go home and think about it. And then she went home, and then she came back 2 weeks later, and she has retold this in several interviews. So she has obviously thought it over. She said that, well, I didn't see a sign, but, and this is the important thing, I don't want to believe in God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Other philosophers and great minds or not so great minds have spoken the same message. People don't want to believe in God because perhaps they don't want to follow God. Perhaps they don't want to follow Jesus. And that's part of all of us. There is a tendency to move away from God because God is holy and I'm not, and perhaps not you either. We aren't complete. We aren't perfect like God is. So that's why we have this tendency to reject God, push him away. But if we instead, as C.S. Lewis stated, and we can conclude with that perhaps, C.S. Lewis says that we don't have the option to say that Jesus is just a great teacher. No. He had greater claims than this. So either you lock him up like a madman, or you lock him up in some other way because he's evil, or you fall down before him and praise him as Lord and God. And that's the option that we have. So shall we end by praying? Lord of heaven, Lord God, Lord Jesus, we thank you that you are alive, Jesus. We thank you that you have conquered death, that you have the keys to death and to hell, and that your resurrection changes life for all people, in all cultures, in all times. And we praise you that this message is true, and that it's based on a solid ground, and that you are the solid rock that we can build our lives on. So do help us, God, when we go out into our daily routines and into our daily people that we meet, and help us to give and present the great news that you are risen. So bless us all. In Jesus' name, amen.